I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome to the 2020 Scottish Regeneration Forum Conference. Now, if you were able to join us in years past, you will remember well the convivial hum of networking and chat that took place in the COSLA Conference Centre in Edinburgh. But of course, new times lead to new realities and new challenges. But within these challenges, there are also, I think, plus points to be taken. Not least that this leap to digital that we've all made has ensured that travel doesn't need to take place for everybody to join us, and our reduction in our carbon footprint that's linked to that. It means that you can join us from wherever you are, and we're so pleased that so many made it to this morning. And also, finally, that the conversations, the and presentations can be shared that much more widely because we'll be recording this session and putting it up online afterwards. So I'd be grateful if you could also recognise that we are recording this session. It'll be up on YouTube, so do take that in mind whenever you are making your contributions. Now, I'd like to give thanks to the sponsors that are enabling SURF to continue its important work. Without their ongoing contributions and ongoing support of SURF, we couldn't continue with the important and unique activities that we undertake across the years. So it's clear that there is an increased importance for SURF and its community-focused cross-sector work at this point, now that we're all surer than ever on three connected realities. Namely, that the stark life and death nature of the poverty and inequalities that we have allowed to develop in communities across Scotland. Secondly, we have seen the inspiring resourcefulness and creative energy of those communities within which we work and their organisations. And I think you'll agree that that's been evidenced robustly over the last 5 months. And finally, the absolute necessity of now directing national policy and resources towards sustaining, growing and connecting community assets and aspirations for a genuinely sustainable future for all. So to make the most of the new possibilities of online engagement, we've split the conference into 3 weekly sessions. And these sessions will focus on that last challenge, growing a genuinely sustainable future for all. So today we're looking at a sustainable climate and economy, and I'm absolutely delighted that Dr. Katherine Trebeck is able to join us from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Next Thursday, on September the 3rd, we'll be making better use of the key asset of land and the importance of accessible transport in connecting people, places and production. And in our final session on September the 10th, we'll be asking what more can be done via Scottish Government policy to create the fairer and sustainable Scotland that we all want to see develop. So, of course, the other benefit of online engagement is that we can keep the conversations ongoing throughout the sessions and also between the sessions. And I would urge you to use the Twitter hashtag, and you can see that on the screen now. Hopefully, if technology is working for us, hashtag SURFCon20. It'll allow your contributions to be shared widely between delegates and also for those not in the room. So without further ado, I'd like to again give you a very warm welcome to the session this morning, and now hand over to Andy Milne, Chief Executive of SURF, who's going to make the connection as to how today's session will run and take us through the introduction for the full agenda. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to Andy. Hopefully, I'll now hand over to Andy.
Hello. Hi.
Andy, lovely,
Hi.
thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I stumbled with my
If anybody has their Zoom bingo cards at the ready, please start completion.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay now? Yeah, is that all right? Good, good, okay. Sorry for that mild technical hitch. I assume that was my fault. Thank you for that introduction there, Kate. That's exactly what we're up for today. This is the first of the 3 sessions of the SURF's conference for 2020. And I'd just like to share this slide here as to how we're going to do that. So you'll see that today's first session will focus mainly on the very welcome input from Katherine Trebeck of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And then we'll be following in on the broad theme of land and transport in a climate emergency, and really delighted that next week at this time we will have Shona Glenn of the Scottish Land Commission and Heather Cowan of Transport Scotland telling us about how those 2 key organisations and the assets that they have influence and control over can be brought into supporting a more successful and sustainable climate and economy. In that session as well, though, we'll also have additional comment from Nick Skelton of Stantec, who are economic geographers and project support delivery organisation, and he'll be reflecting on the practical reality of translating policy into actual regeneration practice. The last session, though, will bring all of that together in the context of Scottish Government evolving and informing Scottish Government policy and how that can best support our shared aims for a fairer and more successful and sustainable Scotland. But SURF as an organisation, as you know, really just exists in the knowledge of its membership and their experience and their contacts and their understanding. So in today's session, as in other sessions, you will have the opportunity to express your views as well as asking questions. And part of that process links to our wider work in drawing together our very broad understanding of what's going on out there, how it connects, how it doesn't connect, and feeding that into a manifesto which we'll be presenting for debate in advance of the next parliamentary elections in May next year. And to that end, my colleague in SURF, Christopher Murray, will give us a short introduction in a minute or so about how that manifesto process is working, where it's going, and some of the stuff that we're learning about that just now. Once we've heard from Christopher, we will then be into the kind of main session involving Katherine. But before we get into the open discussion after that, you will have another opportunity to express your views on some of the key questions that we are looking at as part of this conference process. So I hope that's all pretty much as people expected and hoped, so we'll see how it goes. In the first place, I think it's useful for all of us to know or to get an idea of who have we actually got in the room today. As I've said, SURF is really just a network, but a unique network in its cross-sector nature across all of Scotland, bringing together all the different kinds of partners who are involved in trying to regenerate communities across Scotland. So my colleague Chris Lawrence here is going to help us just go through and just check out, Chris, who we've got here in the room today. So here's the first question, and so here's the first basic one, also kind of test one. Where are you right now? At home, in an office, in your garden? Seems unlikely if you're in Edinburgh today because it's absolutely pouring. In a public park or somewhere else. If you could just vote on that.
And also remember that we've got questions below it and you can scroll down and answer the following questions as well. Which part of the country are you joining us from? And which sector best represents your main profession or voluntary role? And at the bottom, are you expecting another national lockdown this year?
Thank you, Chris.
If you scroll through the questions, you can answer all of them. And once you've finished answering, we'll show you what you're all saying. So it's not going to be a secret vote. It is a public vote. We'll see what the proportion of people are saying for each of those questions. So we're doing fine so far. Getting up to 3/4 of you voted. Great.
And those of you who have been at SURF conferences before and through a similar process will remember that this also allows us later on to have a look at the views of the public sector on particular questions, the views of the private sector on particular questions, etc. We'll be doing that later, Chris, is that right?
Yeah. Well, we will be able to do it after the event. We won't be able to do it during the event, but after the event, we'll be able to look at that as well, yes. And
Great.
we've got almost everybody is with us now. We've got 92%. We could sit here for another half an hour and wait for you all to vote, but this is your chance just to have your vote. If you're happy that you've had your chance, we'll have a look at the results, shall we?
Do that, Chris, yes.
End polling and the results. So most of you are at home. Somebody is in the garden, presumably a marquee, or they have a garden shed or something.
A gazebo.
Yes, I hope the park or the latte is good in the park or the cafe. Which part of the country are you joining us from? Well, most from the Glasgow Lanarkshire from west of Scotland, but everybody is represented there, which is good, including outside Scotland. We have 4 from outside Scotland, which is always intriguing. Which represents your main professional voluntary role. Community groups are there, no housing associations, but individuals, private businesses, public sectors. We're all here, academic institutions. That's good. And are you expecting another national lockdown? Oh, it's close, but well, I think actually with the unsure and not even wanting to think about it, I don't think we've actually got a clear answer there, but it looks quite unpleasant. So that you can see, you can see through the results there. If I just share the results, sorry, I was reading through them, and we can now just share it.
Okay, thank you, Chris. That's helpful. So I hope that's also helpful to our audience in knowing who they are virtually sharing this first session of the conference with. Good. So on good time then, I now have pleasure in introducing a short film, Chris, from our colleague at SURF, Christopher Murray, who's going to tell us all a bit about where we're at with the process of SURF gathering views through a consultation process towards a SURF manifesto for regeneration towards the Scottish parliamentary elections in 2021. So let's hear that.
And Participation Management. This is SURF's 4th manifesto. Previous manifestos have been produced in advance of the Scottish Parliament elections in 2007, 2011 and 2016. Each manifesto is based on extensive consultation and is designed to focus on a complementary set of practical policy recommendations linking physical, social and economic regeneration. SURF follows up on the outcomes of this dedicated effort via its broader and ongoing programme of work. This helps to inform and influence the policies, processes and investments of the Scottish Government, local authorities and other relevant agencies. The manifesto sets out the reality of the contemporary regeneration context and what SURF members would like the Scottish Government to do differently in response to priority problems and opportunities. The manifesto consultation has been organised into 13 separate headings, each covering various aspects of community regeneration. The consultation was originally intended to run as a series of thematic workshops, beginning in April. However, obviously these had to be cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The consultation has, however, proceeded remotely, in the form of semi-structured interviews with a wide range of SURF contacts, each who have particular experience and perspectives on each of our 13 themes. Interviews have been supported via briefing papers, which set out the policy context for each topic and have 10 suggested questions for response. While obviously we can't cover absolutely every policy area, we are confident that a group of themes are those that relate most closely to place-based regeneration as it exists within the Scottish Government's devolved powers. So far, we have completed interviews on poverty and inequality, inclusive growth, which covers economic development, skills and employability, and social enterprise, culture and heritage, and the climate crisis. Interviews on transport will begin in the coming weeks. These will be followed by interviews on housing, community-led regeneration, health inequalities, place, rural policy, local governance, capital investment, and land. Whilst we're still at a relatively early stage in the manifesto process, we thought it was worth sharing some emerging outcomes from the consultation so far. Firstly, some observations around youth employability. There have been particular concerns about the economic impact of the pandemic on young people, who have the least existing resources and work experience to fall back on, and as a result will face higher exposure to poverty and poor mental health as a result. To avoid the negative effects of long-term unemployment, some interviewees have expressed desire for a guaranteed jobs programme to be funded by central government, focused on community development and climate adaptation. Others have suggested an expanded apprenticeship programme concentrating on new manufacturing businesses and specifically targeted at young people. Secondly, restoring community development. A number of interviewees have observed that the pandemic is exposing the loss of local government community development infrastructure that has taken place over the last decade. While most believe nationalist policy is supportive, there is a perceived gap between this and what happens on the ground. They believe that now is the right time to rebuild this capacity with a new generation of community development officers, passionate about reducing inequalities, and with the resources to work with community anchor organisations towards meaningful place-based change. Finally, there has been general scepticism around the concept of inclusive growth. While interviewees were unanimous in their desire for a more inclusive economy, some believe that inclusive growth has been vaguely defined and in some cases has become a box-ticking exercise. There has also been scepticism over whether growth should be a focus of policy and practice, given the climate crisis and the need to place well-being at the heart of the economy. There was also concern over the lack of economic development capacity at a local level to deliver on inclusive growth ambitions. A number of interviewees have highlighted community wealth building as a good model, offering practical actions to deliver on aspirations for inclusive, resilient economies at a locality level. So that's just a brief overview of the process so far. If you'd like to make a submission to the manifesto consultation yourself, briefing papers for each theme covered so far are available on our website. These have suggested questions for response, as I already said, although general comments and suggestions are very welcome. If you'd like to discuss any aspects of the manifesto process, please just get in touch via my email at the bottom of the screen there, or I'm happy to answer any questions in the following Q&A. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks for that, Chris. I hope that was of interest to everybody. I think there's a really good process going on there. I'm going to start my video again. Sorry about that. Thank you, Christopher. I think that was a very useful run through of what is quite a substantial and ongoing process. And in there, as Christopher mentioned, the whole process is about gathering ideas, thoughts, concerns, proposals from across our network, and there will be an opportunity for you to contribute directly to that just shortly through today's process. So, moving on then to the main presentation of the day, no disrespect to my colleague Christopher Murray there, I'm really delighted to be introducing a long-term supporter and colleague of SURF's work, and that's Katherine Trebeck. Katherine, as many of you will know, is now Head of Advocacy and Influencing for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. SURF has worked with Katherine over many years through her period, particularly in Oxfam, when she did a brilliant piece of work really in developing the Humankind Index as a counter to the dominance of thinking around gross domestic product, etc. And Katherine has continued to contribute to SURF's work at other conferences before. So delighted to introduce Katherine. Katherine will now give us about a 15-minute presentation of the position of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in respect of ensuring a sustainable economy and climate together. And we'll then have an opportunity just briefly to check any questions or clarifications with Katherine before we move on to open discussion. So, Chris, if you can kick off the film of Katherine's presentation, I'll be grateful. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi folks, this is actually extraordinarily awkward for me because while I've put up with all the Zoom calls over the last few months and not seeing an audience, not seeing anyone's face, today I'm pre-recording this, and so actually just speaking to myself in my bedroom here. So I hope it doesn't come over as awkward for you as it does for me. I want to talk about sort of the radical change the wellbeing economy entails, and often radical is sometimes given a bad rap, bad press, because it's seen as heretical and naive. But actually, one of the original meanings of the word radical is going to the root of something, going to the root cause. And that's what we need to do to transform our economy. We are in profound moments of change. And I will confess to you, back at the beginning of the year, before COVID, I thought the Australian bushfires would be the catalyst, would be the crisis that sparked our political leaders to take the action needed to transform our economic system. I was, of course, wrong, but what happened then is they were overtaken by this COVID crisis and this sort of new normal that we have, where we're hugging people through plastics and putting plastic around ourselves and separating ourselves from each other. And of course, what COVID has brought in is this extraordinary moment of flux and fluidity where all bets are off in terms of political change. Things that would have been dismissed as unrealistic or too radical a couple of months ago are now being enacted. And I just hope that this is the time we can really take this moment of upheaval, take this moment of huge transformation and reset our economic systems, because they urgently need a reset. And why they need to be reset, we need a massive course correction, is because the economic system we had going into COVID has run its course. It was an economic system that's built around the sort of the constant GDP growth. And yet we know that the benefits of GDP growth tail off. It makes a difference at early stages of economic development and for communities, even those here in Scotland that don't yet have enough. But collectively, in a country like Scotland, growth has hit the stage of diminishing marginal returns, where it is no longer delivering improvements in quality of life, things like life expectancy and things like reduction in poverty. It's actually entering the stage of what experts and people might say in social policy terms is failure demand, where we're spending that growth to patch up and deal with the damage that was created in the pursuit of more growth, in that reactive, downstream, avoidable spending. So in social policy terms, we talk of failure demand. And you can think of the many layers of this. It's almost like an onion, whether it's tax credits to top up people's wages because the labour market's not paying enough, whether it's remedial education, whether it's a lot of the accident emergency treatment in so many of our hospitals, whether it's as seen here in the millions of people who are employed in guard labour, basically because we're scared of each other. It's estimated that in the US, over 5 million people are employed in these guard labour industries, such as security or police or defence. So we're spending so much money. In environmental terms, ecological economists will talk of defensive expenditure. There's just so many layers to this that the apparent need for growth in many instances is actually driven by our inability to create good lives for people first time round. And on the individual sense, there's this wonderful phrase that comes from one of my favourite economists, Manfred Max Neef, who talks about pseudo-satisfiers. This idea that around the world, human beings have fundamental human needs that we all share in common, that what makes us innately human. And yet in different circumstances, we reach for what he calls a pseudo-satisfier. So for example, our need for belonging and social affiliation, we reach for consumer goods and consumer products, when actually spending more time with people might actually be the real satisfier there. But so it is with GDP growth. We are reaching for more and more growth to try to deliver things like quality of life, sense of purpose, sense of meaning, good quality local environment, sustainability on a global scale. And yet it is a pseudo-satisfier, and there's so much evidence for that. So I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion later. I don't want to rehearse the arguments of why things are so bad, but if folks want to dive into that, I'm really happy to. But we've got this situation prior to COVID in places like Scotland, where we're a terrain of diminishing marginal returns, in that growth was no longer delivering the quality of life for people. And actually we were spending a lot, and we still are, in terms of failure demand, reactive spending, things like ecological spending to clean up after floods and after oil spills, after bushfires, enormous amounts of money. And then we've entered this trend where we're reaching for pseudo-satisfiers. We're no longer paying direct attention to what really matters for us as communities. And this is just, to me, one of the most harrowing examples of a pseudo-satisfier, where homeless people in Cardiff were given stab-proof sleeping bags. And I think that just shows how low our expectations are of our social policy and our ability to transform the economy, that the best we can hope for people is for their natural need for shelter and for safety is stab-proof sleeping bags. Anyway, lots of people, even prior to COVID, were talking about the need for fundamental economic system change. Now, this is the Endelman Trust Barometer, and this came out in January. And it says that, you know, around the world, in rich countries like the UK, a majority of people were thinking that they would not be better off in 5 years' time. Globally, half of the people they surveyed thought that capitalism was doing more harm than good, and you can see that in levels of inequality, lack of good jobs, damage to the environment, and this growing sense of equity unfairness of institutions increasingly serving the interests of the few rather than more and more people and serving the majority of people, this sense of political capture. That was prior to COVID. During COVID, and this is a YouGov poll that was taken in early May, you can see here that a huge majority of people, and more so in Scotland, but well over 80% of people are saying that after the pandemic, what should be prioritised is health and well-being, rather than, and you'll see that in the middle set of graphs, rather than economic growth. And again, this just illustrates, to go on top of the huge mounting evidence and academic scholarship and examples of around the world of why we need to change, people are starting to get this as well. People are starting to recognise we need to shift our gaze, have a course correction, and radically transform our economic systems. And that is, too, recognising that in countries like the UK, we have enough wealth and resources. We have arrived. The job of growth has been done. It has delivered what we were hoped it would deliver in terms of creating resources. The challenge for people is that we haven't shared it sufficiently by any means, and we haven't cherished those wealth and resources. And so what we now need to do, recognise we've arrived and make ourselves at home. And that is about building a well-being economy where we attend to distribution and quality of the economy, rather than just growth and growth and growth for its own sake. So what might that well-being economy entail? Now, you can get a sense of what a different economic system might be if you look at the great scholarship of development scholars like Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum or Manfred Max Neef. If you listen to the voices of people who have been engaged in a conversation about what really matters to them, whether that's the massive survey ahead of the UN SDGs a few years ago, whether it's deliberative conversations, say in citizens' assemblies, or various conversations to really speak to people about what their values are most important to them, whether you look at even the brain scans of people that neuroscientists are coming up with that shows different times of when people are stressed or anxious about their lives. If you look at the texts of great religions or even popular songs, if you put all that together, that starts to point to some common values and fundamental human needs. And at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we spoke to our members about what is it that a wellbeing economy needs to deliver. And they came up with 5 things, starting with connection. We need a sense of belonging. We need institutions that serve the common good. It's also about participation, citizens being actively engaged in their communities, economies being locally rooted. It's of course about nature, a restored and regenerated natural world. It's about fairness, justice in all its dimensions, attending to horizontal and vertical inequalities, reducing the gap between richest and poorest. And it's about dignity. It's about ensuring that everyone has enough to live in safety and in comfort. And you put those together and you get the core elements of what a wellbeing economy needs to attend to. How do we build an economy in service of those needs? Well, I think one of the key things is to repurpose our economic system, because if we change the purpose of our economy, then a whole lot of other changes, whether that's tax regimes, incentives, how we design infrastructure, what sort of businesses we support, all those sorts of changes will be much easier to bring about if we've changed the purpose of our economic system. That's why I talk about the need to go beyond GDP. That's why I question when people assume that economic growth is the route to solve all our problems. So we need to stay calm and set new goals. And in order to, once we've done that, we can ask bigger questions about the economy. We can ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting rather than just turning a blind eye to the collateral damage of a growth-orientated economy and then try to patch up the damage that's caused the failure demand, the defensive expenditure. So wellbeing economy is about saying, let's get things right first time around. And that entails maybe a clunky term, but I think a really exciting concept of pre-distribution. How do we design market outcomes to deliver more equality? And one of the key ways of doing that is much more equitable ownership of our economic institutions, whether it's our businesses through employee ownership or economic democracy throughout our other institutions. It's about the foundational economy, leaning on those anchor organisations and thinking about what's their role in just keeping local economies ticking over, and going beyond that even through community wealth building to kick off local economic multipliers through questioning who owns their businesses, who are we procuring to, who is being employed, asking those harder questions of the economic activity and generating an economy from the bottom up rather than waiting for the wealth to trickle down. It's also about things like full cost accounting, taking account of the impact on nature and on society and not turning a blind eye or dismissing them as externalities, not allowing consumers to see misleading prices and then distort how much we spend or produce of a certain economic activity or a certain product. So we need to account for the full cost of activities, excuse me, and that includes thinking about how much of the care economy, so much of that work that women often do, actually underpins our economic system. On our website, we have a rather cool matrix that we call Old Way, New Way, and it sets out how the current economic system, the one we had going into COVID, responded to a whole wide range of different areas of life. And then we set out how a wellbeing economy would respond, the new way. So there are heaps and heaps of examples there, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at it. But to give you a sense of what it looks like, this is one of our partners, Kirsty Flanagan, who's from the Linwood Community Development Trust. And she's talking about what they've done in Linwood because it's a great example of a wellbeing economy being built in practice. They've got a long way to go, but I think they demonstrate in microcosm what a wellbeing economy is about. And she really says it took so much guts for the 6 women that she worked with to get up 10 years ago and say, enough, we need to change this economic model that's being imposed from outside and top down. And then she said, what does it mean? She said, it's about the 12-year-olds coming up to them and asking for their key to their football pitch, and that sense of local ownership, feeling that their local infrastructure and local buildings are for them. That's what Kirsty identified as a wellbeing economy. She says it's about equality, empowerment, ownership, and being given the opportunity to generate their own income. And Linwood has got a plethora of activities, for example, Roots of Linwood, which is delivering fruit and vegetables across Linwood and beyond. And that's owned locally, it's living wage employer. They might not call it community wealth building, but it's one of the key pillars of the jigsaw of building a wellbeing economy. But crucially, Kirsty says, it's not about giving up. It's not about deferring to power. It's saying we can change things. And that sense of empowerment and sense of control over our economy is probably the crux of what a wellbeing economy is about. It's about social justice on a healthy planet and saying it's in our power to build it and to build that change. So how do we piece this together? How do we go about building it? There are loads of examples. How do we connect them all? It's going to take a lot of change, and we've already talked about how we need to shift the goal at the top level of that economic system. But I share this chart just to remind us that we need action at all levels of the economic system. We need the practitioners like the Linwood Community Development Trust, who are in a microcosm, in a niche perspective, rolling up their sleeves and delivering a wellbeing economy. We need policymakers who are changing the policy regime. And we need lots of people having debates about what the very purpose of the economy is about. There's a role for everyone in this because it takes action. It requires action at every level of the system. It's also about supporting the pioneers, people like Kirsty, people like the sorts of organisations that win surf awards every year at your December dinners. It's about supporting businesses who are creating the purpose of their business, whether it's a social enterprise or community interest company or B Corp or economy for the common good company, but using business activities to deliver social and economic and environmental benefits. It's about supporting those policymakers who are going against the grain and saying economic success is not just about GDP, it is about how do we deliver human and ecological well-being. And so as a movement, we need to support those pioneers, have their backs, and shine a light on them, because they literally demonstrate feasibility and desirability of a different way of doing things. And this is the theory of change of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, essentially, that if we can work together, we can achieve extraordinary things. If we collaborate like we've never collaborated before, then we can start to move this system that is so dominant. If we support those pioneers who are going against the grain, then we can change the grain, we can change the policy regime, we can change the purpose of the economy. So this is the call to arms, really, is about how do we piece it together? How will we bring about change? It's through collaboration. Finally, and Andy asked me to think about how do people put themselves, envisage their own role in this. This slide was created by the Real Economy Labs a few years ago, and it's called the Tribes of the New Economy Movement. And I share it because I think it's the most powerful visualization of just how much there is a role for everyone in this agenda, about no matter what your skill set is, what your energy levels are, what you feel your personality is about, where your sphere of influence is, how much time you have, what your day job is, what you're passionate about. There is a role for everyone here, whether you are a disruptor or an enhancer, whether you're a connector or an amplifier, whether you're a stabilizer. So have faith that you are all necessary. The work you do or that you want to get involved in, there is a role for you, there is a place for you in building the wellbeing economy in Scotland. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to be joining you on the day, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And I'll start my video as well so people can see me again. Great film. Thank you, Katherine. So much in there. You've heard from Katherine there about growth, about whether we've actually done enough in terms of growth, and it's now about distribution, about connection, about balance. Katherine talked about how we can have a more purposeful economic focus, thinking about what we measure, what we're trying to achieve, how we can achieve a more equitable ownership of both assets and processes. And I thought there was a really interesting bit in there about the connectivity between the national levels, the intermediary levels and the community levels. That really sounds to me like the sort of role that SURF tries to play in connecting very local stuff with local authorities, with intermediaries, with national agencies, and of course with national government. And earlier you heard from our own Chris Murray about part of how SURF tries to do that through our manifesto process and our questions to the ways in which we try to gather authentic understanding of real processes and the difficulties and challenges, as well as the successes that happen in the efforts that we organise so far. So before we go into, I'm sure there's lots of questions and comments that people want to make. I've even got a few myself. I'll try to resist that as far as I can at this point. But before we go into that, I've said 2 or 3 times, SURF only really exists as a collective awareness and intelligence of all the different partners out there. So there's an opportunity here, given the very varied set of people that we've got in the session today, as we saw from the earlier bit of analysis, there's an opportunity here for us to draw on that. And I think it might be a little useful exercise for us to get a little bit of shared understanding on where our views stand at the moment before we go into that open discussion. So, Chris Lawrence, we've got 5 questions lined up, which we'd like all of our colleagues here today to give us their views on. Would you take us through those 5 questions, please, Chris?
Yep, And just give us one moment while we get the sharing those back. We'll stop sharing those, and we will come through to the, here we are, and launch polling. Here we are. We've got five questions. I'm trying to remember how many questions we've got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, 5 questions on the manifesto process. Just remember to scroll down so you can vote for each of them. Which of the following present the single biggest challenge to achieving a successful and sustainable economy in Scotland is the first question. And you can work your way down. April 2019, the Scottish Government declared a climate emergency. What's your general view of its actions and commitments towards climate change so far? If you had to pick one, which particular areas of society needs to change to most reduce the threat of climate change? What's your view on the wellbeing economy? And if you had to pick one, only one, which of the following policy interventions offer the best value for supporting sustainable economy recovery in Scotland? So there's 5 questions. Please do start your voting and work your way through. 5 questions. We look forward to getting your votes in, and then we'll be able to share them with you and see what you're saying.
Yes, and that'll all help us feed into the open discussion that will follow this little session. Good, so that's beginning to come in, Chris.
Yeah, we've had just 7 so far. There's more to come yet. Mind you, there are 5 questions there that need thinking about. It might take us just a little while to get through this.
Okay, that's okay. We can take that time.
And even while we're voting, there are a few late arrivals coming into the conference as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Some difficult questions here, really. Some quite challenging ones, I think. And you were saying, Chris, that later on, not today, but later on, we'll be able to do some kind of breakdown in how different sector colleagues responded to particular questions. Not individually, of course.
No, but we'll be able to look at whether there are significant differences between the sectors and what they think with these particular questions, as we've done before at the conferences.
Yeah. That will be part of the follow-up process. We'll be doing the similar process next Thursday and the following Thursday. So we'll be gathering really a very wide range of views. Okay, we've now got most people in, but not everybody.
3/4 of the votes in.
Good.
%. They were almost there. 87. I think we're over 90% now have voted, which is really good.
Okay, just give it another minute or so, and then we'll be able to call that there, Chris.
Yeah. Just 2 or 3 left to vote by the look of it.
Great.
I think we're probably at the point where we could go 5,
Yeah, I think so too.
3, 2, 1. I'll end the polling and I will share the results there. So that's, you can see the results now.
So in the first one, Chris, climate change is stand out as the single biggest challenge, followed by Brexit. Oh no, I'm sorry, followed by COVID in the shorter term, and then Brexit, automation of work, that demographic change one with its issues around care and balance of work and retirement is in there as well. Second question, on the Scottish Government having declared the climate emergency, what's the general view of action commitments so far? And not really going far enough yet. Commendable, certainly, and a bit early to judge, but a broad feeling that there's more to be done there. And so if our colleagues had to pick one particular area of society that needs to change most to reduce the threat of climate change, then gosh, that's an exact balance between businesses, banks and investors on one hand, and national and local government on the other. Consumers and voters, though, in there, I think that's really interesting, because I think so much comes back to how we individually act and how we individually vote, and the kind of signals that we give to our politicians and representatives. So interesting responses there. View on the wellbeing economy, massive support for the view that that's a vital shift that we can all be working towards. Really quite reassuring to see that most feel, the vast majority of people feel that they're clear on this. They don't think it's an unhelpful diversion, and they don't think, well, about 10% of people thinking it's well meant but impractical, and we can perhaps come into some discussion on that later. The fifth and last question, if you had to pick just one of the interventions for best value in supporting a sustainable economy, then yep, stand out there amongst the people voting today is investment in community empowerment and well-being, with education, employability and skills coming in close behind that. Very interesting. Okay, thank you for helping us through that there, Chris. And I hope that those presentations of the collective thoughts of our colleagues today will be useful as we move into now the main final session here, which is the interactive open discussion session. And I'll look to my colleague Emma Scott to keep me right here on questions and who's asking them, and I will do my best in chairing what we hope will be quite a lively interactive session. So, questions. Where are we going first, Emma, do you think?
Well, if anybody that has a question can raise their hand or indicate it in the chat box, then I'll pick it up from there, Andy.
Okay.
Andy, can I start by reflecting on one of the poll questions around?
Yeah, do that, Katherine.
I was really heartened to see such breadth across which actors in society need to play a role in this, and particularly the role of the media. I think a lot of folks indicated that was old and new. I think Chris had framed it. And I think that's really vital, because a lot of civil servants and even a lot of politicians I speak to, I think, really get the need for this substantial change. I think people really understand the flaws of measures such as gross domestic product. And I think the challenge now is how we hold our politicians accountable. And I often think until the day after the budget, Rishi Sunak or Kate Forbes, when they're in the media studio the next morning while people are making their breakfast and getting ready for work, until the first question from Gary Robertson or John Humphreys or Nick Robbins on Radio 4 or on the sofas, until that first question is, what is this budget going to do for levels of loneliness, levels of homelessness, biodiversity loss, ecosystem preservation, rather than, is this going to get our economy going again? Is this going to get us firing on all cylinders? Is this going to bring growth back? Until that political accountability question is brought about by media attention, I think we'll be a long way there. And because I think a lot of at least civil servants that I engage with and politicians do understand the need for change. And I think that the role of media is vital. So I was really heartened to see folks really pointing to that as a key actor.
So one of our colleagues here, Ian Wall, is saying, obviously in agreement, Katherine, but is saying, look, we've had various attempts at shifting this balance before through religious communities, through communes, even, and the cooperative movement was a major effort. And Ian's feeling is, well, you know, those were substantial efforts, but they all ended up reverting back to pretty much business as usual. So Ian's saying, what is it that needs to be different this time to make it not just a background effort, but something that actually changes the whole framework? What do you think?
I think that's why that slide, that rather geeky slide of the multi-level system perspective really is so important, because it's not enough just to demonstrate what change needs to happen. So Paulo Freire, a lot of you probably know his work. talks about you make the path by walking. And I think, yeah, of course, that's a nice phrase. But you know what? If no one knows that that path is worth walking on and no one comes after you, that path will soon become overgrown. So there needs to be a conversation about scaling across and encouraging others to replicate these sorts of activities, these sorts of practices that we need to build in order to shift, you know, take the economy towards a tipping point. And I also think we need to go beyond just prefiguring, in that lovely term of, you know, creating the microcosm, into changing the policy regime. What's great about all the practices that we have now, there's so many examples that demonstrate what a different economic system looks like. But if they don't translate to policy regime, they'll be going against the grain, they'll be against the headwinds. And hence, so for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we see ourselves as what I describe as the arrows between the layers and the players. And so taking the messages from that practice at community level, or the practice of amazing progressive businesses, and channeling it upwards to policymakers to say, look, this is not a step into the unknown. You just need to help create a policy regime that's much more conducive to that sort of work.
Good. So there's two questions here, which I think are potentially linked. And one is frankly mine, or it has been put to me by members of the SURF board. And that is, what's needed here to make that kind of shift and to make politicians feel safe in taking these bolder steps, and to getting the media into a different kind of mindset, is the sense that the public out there, the general uninvolved, in their own communities public, can see some material benefit and improvement. Oh, that's better. That looks better to me. What is it that people would see in their own communities that would think, this is great, this is a better way of doing things? So and related to that, Catherine, and I might ask to bring our chair, Kate Wimpress, in on this, is we've already got this quite innovative system in Scotland of the Citizens' Assembly, which Kate Wimpress, SURF chair, also convenes the Citizens' Assembly. And where's the relationship between that discussive exploration in the Citizens' Assembly and the work that you're talking about? So what would be obvious to ordinary people that this is a better way of doing things, and the Citizens' Assembly? So that one first on, what would people notice, Catherine, do you think?
So I want to go into almost the beginning bit of your question around politicians feeling safe. And I'm old enough to have watched some of those early episodes of Yes Minister, when the sort of the recalcitrant head of the civil service would try to stop his minister doing something by saying, "That's very brave, Minister." And I think we need braver politicians right now. We need bolder politicians, because that, you know, this is what it's going to take. And I think there is a role in building that sense of appetite for this via public demand for this, and mobilization of a conversation. And so that's why we're spending a lot of time working on sort of the narratives. How do we tell the story of the possibility and the desirability of a different economic system? Because yes, we do have some brave politicians, but perhaps not enough. So we need to help create that space. And that's what political scientists would talk about, this idea of the Overton window. We need to shift that pace of that space of what's politically desirable. And and I think, as I showed some of those statistics, there is public demand for a lot of work. I mean, there's plenty of evidence, but in terms of, and I think there's plenty of evidence of people just sort of at the end of their tether with trying to cope with the current economic system, people being burnt out, feeling alienated, knowing that their lifestyles and the living standards of their children and their grandchildren won't be better than those before. And so I think when we're talking about economic system change, and when I describe wellbeing economy as about social justice on a healthy planet, it is about directly attending to those concerns. So it's about improved quality of life. It's about having businesses that pay enough people so they don't need to work 3 jobs on minimum wage just to put food on the table. It's about having more work-life balance as well, and having enough sufficiency of income. So it's about asking much more of the economy and not waiting for the crumbs to trickle down. It's creating that sort of ownership. So that's why I'm such a fan of that idea of pre-distribution, and through things like cooperatives, where people are part of the economic activity. They get the value that they create, rather than seeing it go up to the top 1% or 0.1%. And so there's plenty of example in terms of, you know, nicer communities in a physical sense, in terms of just regenerating our local environments. And I think at the heart of all of that is a sense of greater control over their lives, having a sense that they're not just at the beck and call of these wider remote economic forces. And in terms of the practical examples, the bit that I'd gone, just to tell the audience, I had a slightly longer presentation. The bit that we cut out because I blabbed on too much was some practical examples that I took from the old way, new way table in terms of work life, how in terms of our work, it would be moving away from top-up wages and hyper-specialization and automation and huge gaps between richest and poorest and people being treated as just-in-time inventory. I mean, that's what we see with the gig economy. People are literally on demand at the click of an app. And yet we can't treat our fellow neighbors and family and friends as just disposable and just-in-time inventory. And so a wellbeing economy would be, a response to that would be, for example, thinking about how do we design workplaces better and jobs better, where work is better shared, where it's better quality, where people have more control over their work and have ownership of the firm. So in terms of practical examples, there are loads on that old way, new way. And I just also, there's a lot of experts here who are in this audience who are delivering these sorts of changes. And just as a request, that document, the old way, new way, is a live document. So we're really keen for people to add their suggestions and we'll add them to that table. And in terms of the Citizens Assembly process, I was really honoured to be part of Kate's Citizens Assembly back in the crazy old world of pre-COVID days where we could meet together. And I mean, it really was quite an honour because it was speaking to 100 people that were representative of Scotland. It was a mini Scotland. And I'm a student of deliberative democracy. I used to study with one of the great scholars of deliberative democracy. And so I have been involved, as you said, in projects where you create space for people to talk with each other about issues that matter to them. And I have faith that through those conversations, when they're constructed in the right way, where people are given resources that mitigate the barriers to participation. So for example, taking account of people's time, putting on childcare, making sure all voices are heard and it's not just those who have got the confidence to shout over other people. When those conditions are in place, and we can't take that as given, we need to be really attentive to those conditions. But when they are in place, you get extraordinary conversations and extraordinarily ambitious, magnanimous, collective focus in those sorts of conversations. And so I think the role of those sorts of democratic processes are vital in about how we'll create a wellbeing economy, and also not just how we'll create it, but when we'll know we'll get there. That would be part, a feature of a wellbeing economy as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Kate, would you like to sort of say something on how you're seeing the connection between those inclusive and progressive discussions and the connections to politicians' priorities and the operation of levers then for change? I mean, I've got colleagues here noting that, you know, many of us have been working at this stuff literally for decades, and there have been points in the past where it's looked like some real change in a positive sense is going to take place, and yet it's kind of ebbed away. Yeah. How are we going to make the connections to see that this point of crisis is a point of positive change as well?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I certainly don't want to take up too much time today, but I just wanted to reiterate Catherine's points that it's enabling this space for deliberation is key to it, and it's got to be very well protected and set up. But I think the thing that I've witnessed with amongst the Assembly members is the ability for minds to be changed in a space where you've got seemingly intractable issues coming to the fore, but minds are changed and there's that collective action, and I think that's what is key to Catherine's work and the work of SURF as well, is that people, whenever they actually get to know each other and can un-other each other, there's an ability to look at fairly bold collective actions that need to take place to enable change, because people stop talking about the individual and start talking about the collective. And I think that's the key to it. In terms of enabling political debate, we, at the request of the Assembly members, we had a politicians panel. And actually, I think within that panel, there was a chance for the politicians to not be politicians. And I suppose that's the key to it, for them to be able to reflect back that, that when people have the chance to deliberate fully, they will make bold choices, and so therefore the politicians don't need to shy away from that. And I think we can look at the Irish example as a very clear chance and an opportunity where that happened.
I've been in situations before, Chatham House rule discussions, where really quite senior politicians have said, look, I believe this stuff, I get this stuff, I understand, as an individual human being, as a mother of children, whatever, I understand this stuff. But actually, I can't do this within the present political framework. And the present political framework results from a whole variety of pressures, not just from the well-meaning souls who are around this particular virtual table today. And a couple of our colleagues here around the table are quite rightly pointing to, well, some of the major players are private sector corporations, and the way in which they choose to make their investments, the way they choose to run their businesses, the kind of priorities they adapt. Now, we're seeing some shifts, at least superficially, in how those organisations are presenting their prospectus. But questions are quite rightly being raised by colleagues today as to how do we really get them on side beyond their PR department? Catherine?
You go first,
Sorry.
Kate.
I was just going to say, Catherine, I think from your presentation in the slides, it was the diagram with the niche and the regime. I think that was the key slide for me. So I think I'd pass back on that point.
And I think I really understand that. I mean, look, this is why I'm confident in the merit of this agenda, is because people have been working on this for so long. For decades, people have been building the evidence base and critiquing the dominant economic model. I mean, just, you know, feminist scholars for decades have been saying, hang on a minute, GDP doesn't include so much of the vital work that's done outside the formal market economy, and ecological economists have equally been putting up, you know, this mountain of evidence. I mean, it goes back to prior to, but one key moment of 1972, the Limits to Growth report, and their standard run predictions have been borne out thus far. This isn't a new conversation. And just as there's scholars, the activists and communities and movements have been building around this, which is why I feel that, you know, this isn't a new flash in the pan idea. This has got long roots and a huge amount of evidence in theory and in practice. But I think what I pick up from some of the questions, I haven't had a chance to read them directly yet, is that there's just sense of exhaustion when the system bites back, the system pushes back. And my goodness, I could share the scars of those having that happen as well. And we see it just recently in the last few weeks. I mean, in terms of the debate around the advisory group on economic recovery, I mean, the reversion to orthodox thinking about the economy is, despite all that evidence, is pretty tragic, I think, and shows a pretty sad reflection on the state of the debate in Scotland and beyond. And I agree in terms of large companies. I mean, I don't think we can underestimate their power and the extent of political capture. And then this is what Donella Meadows, who's one of the greatest system thinkers I know of, the late Donella Meadows, who talks about success to the successful. That when you have economic might, you can design the rules of the game. And this is what we are up against, we collectively, as this movement of people who want to sort of transform the economic system. And so hence why we need to collaborate. We will never match the massive bank accounts of, you know, the Koch brothers and so on, who are funding those, say, climate denial think tanks, who are behind those, you know, people who can whisper in the ears of politicians and, you know, argue for tax breaks or no conditionality on bailouts of certain industries and so on. There's so many examples where we see political capture. But what we have to do, the only other option we've got, is to mobilise with multiple hearts and hands. Hence why things like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance were created. But I don't think we can be naive to the extent of system, reversion. The other thing that's heartening, and I suspect from what you've said, people are already pointing to this, that there are some people deep within the heart of these big major organizations that do get it. I mean, we speak to a lot of folk in the investment community who are really desperate to look beyond quarters, to take a wider sense of what their investment decisions matter. We talk to people within big agencies, big global agencies, big deep heart of the mainstream media. There are people who get it, and there's a role to work with them, to support them, bring about change.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, SURF sees a role for itself in making some of those bridges to, if not directly to those corporations, then to representative bodies of those corporations or people who invest in them. Emma, we've got some other questions out.
Yep, and I'm just going to bring in Martin Avelia, so I'll ask him to unmute his mic, and then Linda Christie after that.
Thank you, Emma.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much, Emma. I think my question was about, quite often we lay out this grand vision of where we would like to get to, which in a sense is potentially what overwhelms us. So I'd like to know, how do we set the first milestones on this goal? What should we be working towards? So how do we set these first milestones on the transition to a wellbeing economy? And what should those milestones be?
Very clear and specific, Martin. Can we hear from Linda as well, please, Emma, before we try to get a response to Martin's point?
If Linda can unmute.
Yes, I've unmuted, Emma. Thank you for bringing me in. Hi, Catherine. It's lovely to see you here. I think my questions are probably typically of the economist mind, which I am, and I have tried over the years to really broaden my thinking, having been directly responsible for delivering what I would call key benefits that are inclusive from growth. And so what I would probably say to you then, Catherine, is ask you, I think this movement towards a community wealth building thinking is a good one. I'm not sure about the focus on community. I think it should be called more inclusive wealth building, so that we can also include these big corporates. And I think that this is where the impact is going to be honest. The privates, our corporates are providing the majority of the jobs. And the gaps in our income are between those wealth accumulators and the people at the lower end of society. So really it's about how they distribute their wealth. I really don't think we're doing enough on that. What do you think about that? You've kind of commented a wee bit in the comments. But what that means is I do still think economically we do need to still see progress in GDP.
Yeah.
And it's about saying to these corporates, yes, we need wealth accumulation and we need to distribute that. How can we ask you to better distribute it? So what do you think about that, Catherine? How do you think we can do that better?
Good. Okay. So thank you, Linda and Martin. Martin, first of all, on where are the practical milestones that we should be setting as individuals? Like Martin runs the excellent Kinning Park Centre, great work there. And Linda, really important point, and one that I'm very interested in too, because I do worry in some of this debate that we put the job of building wealth, of solving sustainability challenges onto communities. And I think we need to broaden our thinking as to what communities are beyond individual residents and organisations in geographical places. So, Katherine, any response?
So, Martin, in terms of milestones, I think it depends what sector and what actor we're talking about, because I think different areas of this effort will have different milestones that are relevant for them. So if we're talking, say, at the level of government, I think if we are really bold in, say, taking something like the National Performance Framework, which is a lot better than what it used to be. It's not yet brilliant. I think we need another bit of a polish to it, but it is what it is. And I think it's up there with some of the best in the world in terms of setting out a wellbeing framework. Well, one of the key next steps would be to saying, right, let's better connect that to the Scottish budget decision. Let's better scrutinise policy decisions according to those National Performance Framework goals. For businesses, for example, maybe their first milestone would be not focusing on quarterly profits and quarterly reporting, but taking a much longer term view of what their success is. Maybe it will be bringing in other stakeholders to around the table of corporate business decision making. For groups like SURF, it would be perhaps to think about, things like their manifesto work. I mean, so a lot of people are already doing this sort of work. I think in terms of milestones and steps towards it, it depends on where you are in that system, because all of these efforts have different spheres of influence and impact. For me, this is why I keep reverting back to the conversation about what is the purpose of the economy, because I think a lot of those changes will be much easier to bring about if we do really train our gaze about what the role of the economic system is and see the economy and things like growth. What are we going to grow more of? What do we need more? Who needs more? In what circumstances? How are we going to create it? If we see the economy as a means to that higher order end, those first principles, if you like, of social justice and sustainability and reposition, because I think that's something in the debate in Scotland we confuse a lot. We put the economy and growth as a goal in and of itself, rather than as a contributor to what it is we're really asking about. That's why I talked about the pseudo satisfiers. And in terms of Linda's questions, it's a really interesting point around the phrase community wealth building, and is that putting all of the onus on community, who are already stretched enough and working so hard, exhausted to do so. I think that's a really interesting reflection, and it's about who has the onus of agenda setting, and I think maybe that's, if we can put sort of understand the phrase community wealth building in that sense, around wealth building for who and on whose terms, but understanding it's not just about putting all the effort and responsibility on communities in isolation. In terms of corporates, I mean, I think there's a big spectrum between businesses across the board, with all the social small and medium enterprises who do actually provide the bulk of the employment in Scotland. Corporates are very powerful and very, they're the ones with the big names and the big brands, but they're not actually the ones who are providing the bulk of the employment across places like Scotland and the rest of the UK. I think I have a challenge with the idea of grow wealth and then distribute it. And I think it's, to me, part of my frustration with this sort of social democratic solutions, settlement in places like Scotland and a lot of Europe over the last few decades, that we see to think that the goal is to grow the economy big and create as much wealth as you can, and then put the blinkers on to the collateral damage that does to communities and to the environment along the way. And then what we do is we try to sequester some of the money back through taxes. And we know that the greater levels of inequality, the harder that is to do, the political machinations that go into that process. And then we use some of that money to redistribute, which shows that we've already allowed the gap between rich and poorest to open up in the first place. Yeah. And we then use it to do that sticking plaster.
I thought that part in your film, at the start of your film, Katherine, about how much we are paying for the present deficits in the present system, and how obscure that has become to everybody, how much we pay that we really shouldn't be having to pay if we organise differently. Okay, we've got a couple of other questions to come in. Emma?
Yeah, I'm going to bring in Isabel Davies. If you could unmute your mic. Isabel?
Isabel out there?
Just while she's unmuting, I've just seen a comment back from Linda around zero growth. I think we've got to stop using the term growth without defining it. Growth is an abstract term. And until we say what sort of growth, in what circumstances, for whom, it's as abstract as if I was to say to you, Andy, move. Your first question will be, in what direction? Faster, slower, up, down. I mean, we've got to, surely Scotland is sophisticated enough that we can have a richer conversation about what it is growth. So it's not this false binary between growth is good or growth is bad. It's about having a richer conversation about what do we need to deliver for human and ecological well-being, and some sorts of growth in some circumstances will be appropriate in service of that goal. But just to, you know, we've got to be, I'm so frustrated in Scotland because we've had this recently in discussions around the way the government is just defining a wellbeing economy, and Benny Higgins' report and so on. It's using growth in this sort of really just sort of abstract term. And I think surely in Scotland, you know, where we've got a, you know, small community and lots of intelligent people, we can kick it open a little bit and say what it is it we need more of.
So my guess is, my uninformed guess is, that Benny Higgins had a real job on his hands in presenting that report while holding more sceptical private sector interests on board the debate, really, because as we've acknowledged, the private sector is a huge influencer in how things go now and in the future, and so need to be very much on board. I suspect some of this is about really intelligent use of language and terminology as well, to sort of help people understand the concepts and to build a kind of shared understanding. Emma, we were getting a couple of questions.
Is Isabel there now? I think she's
yes, I'm unmuted now. Hi.
Hi, Isabel, please go ahead.
I'm not quite sure which question you're referring to.
You raised a few points on the kind of chat panel, and I don't know if you wanted to discuss any of those.
I accept the principle of community wealth building, and I think unless we can drive change from the bottom up, it won't happen. The problem is getting through to people and the inertia at the top. I also think the issue is wider than Scotland. I don't think we can do it on our own.
Yeah.
And I think this, you know, globalization is perhaps an issue, and maybe sort of the use of things like the UN sustainability indicators, which have been agreed to help develop other countries to an acceptable level of living standards, should also be part of our targets.
Very good, Isabel. Thank you for that. I think that's a good, I mean, one part of my mind was going to, like, Scotland is at a particular place at the moment in considering the whole question of being raised again of where does Scotland want to go in the future? Where does Scotland want to go in its relation to the rest of the UK? Where does it want to go in relation to Europe? So I think bringing our thinking round, as you suggest, Isabel, back into the rest of the world and the kind of issues and debates going on there is important. There was another question.
I think we've lost Stephen, Andy, so I'm going to bring in Annette Hastings, who's raised a couple of points on
Can I add to Isabel's comment there? Is that all right, Andy?
Yeah.
I mean, I really agree, and one thing that's really heartening is Scotland taking leadership of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, We Go, which is New Zealand, Iceland and Wales alongside Scotland, and hopefully you'll see a few other governments join in the next months and years. And it was set up because all of these governments share a sense that they want to put wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making, but they don't have all the answers on their own. So they want to learn from each other. So it's a good example of Scotland humbly reaching out to global players.
Great, thank you. Emma.
That's Annette Hastings.
Annette, good, thank you. Annette.
Hi there. I actually probably don't have a question. I was just sort of, you know, taking part in the discussion, but it is, you know, I think the various points which are about how we really get traction for these really important ideas, I think are just worth thinking about, you know, talking about more, because I made a point in the chat there, there's a similar argument around the costs of inequality and how reduced inequality benefits everybody from the top of the income spectrum to the bottom. And it seems such a simple, clever argument to make that you thought, goodness, that's the moment in which we all get it. Yeah. Similarly, your points, Catherine, about the costs of redistribution. If we did pre-distribution, we would all benefit. You know, it's a similarly really engaging argument. How can we make that really cogent argument? How can we get people to actually listen and act on it, I guess?
So we're just starting a project that I would love people's help on to try and tally up the cost of that collateral damage. And it will be an art, not a science, because, you know, how do we measure this precisely? But how much of our health budgets could have been avoided if we had a more equal, more socially just economy? How much of our expenditure on cleaning up after, you know, hurricanes and so on could we avoid if we'd had a more sustainable economy? Our, you know, criminal justice system, our social policy, you know, our transfers. I mean, at the moment we've seen debate about the child poverty payment and the £10 a week top up payment. That is a dire sign of failure, and yet our expectations are so low. We've come to celebrate that as a win in social policy terms. And of course it's urgent right now because families need it to survive, but we also need to be thinking about how can we create an economy that avoids the need for such downstream mitigation. So we're just starting a project looking at the Scottish budget and also the Canadian budget as well, and it's going to be really difficult. So if anyone has expertise in trying to help us take a credible estimate of some of those the costs of the collateral damage of the current economic system, I'd love to hear from you.
Good, Catherine, thank you for that. I can't resist saying that I get interested and a bit frustrated when I hear very senior Scottish politicians apparently boasting that we spend more on health than other parts of the world. Surely spending on health is a measure of failure rather than a measure of success. I mean, there's a widespread and very correct veneration of the NHS, but we should all be doing our bit to take the load off the NHS by investing in houses and jobs and better environment. That's the end of my little preach there.
Wouldn't it be great if for the next Scottish election we had politicians saying, do you know what, under my watch there'll be 1,000 fewer police and 1,000 fewer nurses because we've kept people healthy and safe in their communities. I mean, that is the shift we need in the conversation. One of the projects I'm working on at the moment is what a wellbeing budget for Scotland might look like. And I think part of that, the tricky thing is that balance between the urgent, acute need right now and that shift towards creating the conditions of well-being for people. And so that's a delicate balancing act that I don't envy politicians and government having to make. But I think having a wider conversation will help, as we've said earlier, buy them that political space and help them be brave into.
Absolutely. So I think we collectively, SURF and all of its organisations, Martin, Avia and other colleagues out there, we can demonstrate, we can show how things can be done and where the additional collateral benefits are. We can demonstrate that through the awards. But what we've also got to do is we've got to make the connections of those lessons and form it into a language which then helps shift that broader debate and consensual permission across the media and into politicians for them to not just say these things, but be able to take those very bold investment actions. So I'm going to just draw this to a bit of a close here, if that's okay, certainly the open discussion session. Huge thank you to Katherine for our contributions, both in the film and in that in responding so intelligently to many of these great questions that have been pitched in. Next week's session, next Thursday, we are going to look, we've talked today in very broad terms, haven't we? Next Thursday, we're going to look at the more practical reality, the most tangible reality of land in relation to economies, communities, sustainability, and connecting land and places through transport as a means of accessibility, of connecting people, of connecting places, of connecting production in a successful and fair Scotland. So that will be next week's session with Shona Glenn from the Scottish Land Commission and Heather Cowan from Transport Scotland, along with Nick Skelton from Stantec. So if you haven't already signed up for that, I'm kind of glancing at Emma, I'm assuming there's still some spaces for people to sign in. I'm going to finish my contribution there with a broad thanks to everybody again, particularly Katherine and to our own Christopher Murray there. Emma, you're going to do just a little bit of information on some other stuff that's coming up, and then I'll look to our chair, Kate Wimpress, to close the session. Over to you, Emma.
Well, let's just hope. So I'm going to say in advance that I live in the sticks, so my connection with my sharing screen has been a wee bit slow. So if you bear with me, we should get there.
And if not, just talk it through, Emma.
If not, I'll just chat it through. We seem to be at the end slide, which is helpful. And you could maybe tell some jokes while we
Jokes. I'm not so great in jokes. The only joke I ever told is when we were at the wards, and I joked that we were going to introduce a rural economy award and give it to a particular farmer who was outstanding in his field.
Boom, boom.
Boom. I'm here all week, as they say.
Right,
Is your system coming up?
Okay, stop sharing. So I'm actually just going to talk through it rather than try and share it. So
Yep.
I had some slides just on SURF membership. So if you're not a SURF member or you're thinking about being a member and haven't actually joined, membership is £20 for individuals and community groups, and then £50 for larger organisations. It's an absolute bargain. You can share through events. We'll share your events on our website and press releases and things like that. You get priority access to all our events. So you get 1 week's advance notice and a booking period, because some of our conferences sell out within a week. So it's always good to know these things when they're coming up so you can get your booking in. So if you are interested in membership, you can drop me an email, emma@surfscot.scot, and I'll help you sign up for that. After that, we've also, as Andy touched on, the awards, and I think they've been mentioned a few times today. Yep. The SURF Awards are currently open for applications. They actually close a week on Monday, so we're getting pretty close to the deadline, but still plenty of time to get your application in. The 7th at 5 PM is the deadline. There's 5 categories. It's Scotland's Most Improved Place, which has previously been won by places like Lochgelly and Kilmarnock, Westray, and last year it was actually won by the Calton Barras in Glasgow City Centre. We've got the Youth Employability category, which we've had various winners across the years, from housing associations to projects like the DRC and Working Right. We have the Creative Regeneration category, which is always popular because there's a lot of creative arts, and actually North Edinburgh Arts won that several years ago, along with a few other people that are probably on this call today. We have the Housing and Regeneration category, which I'm going to say for the first time has a sponsor this year, and that's SFHA. So if you have a housing development that you would like to put up, then get that in there. And then the last category is by far the most popular category, and that's the community-led regeneration, which has been won by a variety of projects, from tree houses to international women's centres. So that is definitely the most popular. All the materials are on the SURF website under SURF Awards. But again, if you've got any queries, then drop me an email and I'd be happy to discuss that. So just lastly, I'm just going to say that Andy said we've got 2 events still to come. If you're interested in booking on to those, there are places left for next week and very limited places for the final session with Aileen Campbell on the 10th. So if you want to book them, you can go back to the SURF website. We originally booked for this under events, but if it's the 3rd one you're interested in, then I would get in there pretty quick, because places we're down to the last few places on that. And lastly, I sent out an evaluation form to everyone, and if you could please fill that out, it will only take a few minutes, and email it back to me, I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emma. It just remains for me to give my very sincere thanks to Katherine for joining us this morning. It was such a stimulating and lively discussion. Thanks to everybody who took part. I think there's an urgency for change, which obviously the recent events have led us to, and I'm very much looking forward to being a part of kicking open some ideas. I think SURF can use its networks and connections, as we have done this morning, to interrogate possibilities and assist with gaining traction. And I sincerely hope that we as an organisation will be part of the growing number of people who want to walk the path. So thank you very much for your time. We're 1 minute over. I hope that doesn't interfere with the rest of the day. And I sincerely hope we see many back at the next 2 sessions for the conference. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you. Bye.